Hey, thanks, Tracy, and good afternoon, everybody. And special thanks to Abe for asking me not just to participate, but to moderate the panel. And as Tracy said, I mean, we have a great set of two guests to join us. And joining me on the panel today are two folks that when you hear someone say, especially on Capitol Hill, like, "Hey, we have the smartest people are in the room." Working on these issues and things like that, it's definitely in reference to the two guests we have here today. First is Mary Martin. She is the Chief Counsel for Energy and the Environment for the House Energy and Commerce Committee Republicans. And then also we have Scott Mattis, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, who represents the 9th District up in New York. For those that don't know the districts in New York, essentially it's Brooklyn. That's where the Congresswoman represents. And Scott is the energy guru for that office. So, welcome, Scott. Welcome, Mary. Happy recess. I think it's recess, as we joked before you got on here. I feel your guys' recesses are getting smaller and smaller, and you guys are working more and more when you guys are on recess. But with that, let's kind of keep and jump into the discussion, kind of lead right into the first question, which is really focused of the panel's title, and it's the review of the first 100+ days of the 117th Congress from an energy policy perspective. How would you all feel the first 100 so days have gone so far from an energy perspective? Maybe I'll start with Scott and then turn it over to Mary. Scott?
Thanks, Eric. And thank you, Tracy, and thank you to Abe. It's great to be here. Great to be in front of all your members for this important briefing. To get at your question, Eric, I would say to start off, before this 117th Congress even began, just to set the stage here, the House and the Senate were already hard at work from an energy perspective. Right at the end of last year, we passed the Energy Act, which authorized a lot of funding for RD&D into innovative energy technologies. We have been hard at work over the past multiple years developing a number of legislative proposals, comprehensive ones, that get at the climate crisis and how we can achieve a cleaner energy future. On the committee where Mary works and where my boss serves, the congressman serves, we have a piece of legislation called the Clean Future Act that is about 1,000 pages long and addresses a whole host of issues within the energy sector. But to get your question more directly, I would say that the first 100 days so far have really been driven by the Biden administration. You've seen pretty much President Biden trying to walk two paths, which has been challenging, but he's been, I would say, largely successful at it. He's been trying to achieve his progressive environmental goals that he's ran on, while simultaneously trying to keep energy prices down and make sure that more moderate folks in the middle are also happy who helped him to get elected. Some quickly notable things that have happened, Eric, are canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. This was a big request from progressive activists and something that I don't think Biden had a choice on. He's approved the Vineyard Wind 800 megawatt offshore wind project on the East Coast. It's going to take place. He has moved to reinstate tailpipe emission standards for light duty vehicles, now like CAFE standards. And he's really worked, as I think Tracy was mentioning, to incorporate environmental justice throughout the energy sector and really almost every sector through his Justice 40 initiative, which tries to get 40% of the benefits of any policy towards the groups who are most impacted, whether that's communities of color, low-income communities, certain rural communities, you name it. And to do this, he's also brought on folks like Shalonda Baker to DOE, where she is leading an office on energy justice. He's brought in Montina Cole to FERC to incorporate environmental justice into FERC. So in a lot of ways, the first 100 days have been reactionary to the Trump presidency, with Biden not really putting forward his own agenda up until more recently, where we've seen he came out with his American Jobs Plan. And now Congress has the opportunity to step in and to create legislation and reuse a lot of legislation we already had to bring that American Jobs Plan to life. And that's exactly what we are doing.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. Mary, what are your thoughts on kind of the first 100 or so days that this Congress has been in session?
Sure. So again, thanks so much for moderating the panel, Eric, and thanks to the folks at AABE for the invitation. Really appreciate that. Just a reminder, I'm here in my personal capacity, not speaking for the committee directly, and appreciate the off the record nature of the conversation. I would say in terms of the first 100 days, I think from our side of the aisle, there's been probably a lot of disappointment in terms of some of the decisions and some of the visions that are being put out by the administration. I mean, day one, canceling the Keystone Pipeline it sounds like a huge message on maybe both sides of the aisle, but I think for a lot of our members was really disappointing. You know, it has sent a message throughout that American jobs maybe not as important as some thought it was going to be under this administration. I think too, you've seen in the last couple of months things like the administration asking OPEC to start producing more oil. You see gas prices rising at the pump. I mean, we were in a state a year ago where we were much more energy secure here in this country. It is something that I think everyone championed, the fact that we weren't relying on oil and other energy sources from other countries, particularly not our non-allies, not our friends. And so I think that's been to be honest, there's been some kind of surprise how quickly that has shifted and turned. And I think some of that, unfortunately is coming from the messages and direction that's being sent by this administration. So I think that's something that I think we're really focused in on here. I would say too, I appreciate Scott referencing the Energy Act of 2020. That was something that we spent a lot of time working on and negotiating in a bipartisan, bicameral way the last 2 or 3 months of last Congress. And, really, I think all of us were really proud of that work, got to a good place in terms of balance with fuel sources and energy sources that were covered in that. It was about $36 billion of funding. I think 30 of that was research and development. Again, so just that was we were hoping that was kind of what the spirit that we were going to take into this Congress and into this new administration. I know a lot of our members were talking about the importance of getting that funded and appropriations for it and getting this administration to implement those. And so that's something I think our members would like for us to be focusing on more, as opposed to what we view as probably more partisan and not positions of compromise on some of these different issues. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And you kind of touched a little bit on, we're taking a look back, and maybe as the follow-up question, let's look forward. Like, where do you see the debate on energy policy going? Not just towards the end of this year with, there's a lot of discussions around the bipartisan infrastructure package and budget reconciliation, talk a little bit about that, but then also past that. I mean, do you see energy issues playing a big role in the midterm elections? Maybe I'll just continue with Mary and then have Scott follow in. So, Mary?
Sure. So I would say in terms of looking forward, I think that you're going to see a lot of things happening, particularly at FERC, at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The committee actually just had our budget hearing with all 5 FERC commissioners before we left for recess. And I think that's going to be a place where there's going to be a lot of activity, both from the infrastructure, energy infrastructure, whether it's pipelines, transmission lines, LNG export facilities, but then also on the market side more and electricity markets. But I think that's one place. And I think, when it comes to infrastructure, a lot of times, at least what we hear, especially from utilities, is it's not issues of capital. It's really issues of being able to get things sited and the planning and the permits and the approvals and getting things through those processes, which often is what's tripping up some of the plans and projects. And I think that is true for whether you're talking about building big interregional transmission lines to try to get more renewables, whether you're building wind projects. Scott mentioned the Vineyard project, which has been around for a long time, or you're trying to build natural gas pipelines. And so I think that's something I hope we can still keep trying to focus on and work on ways to remove those different barriers and make a difference. Go ahead.
No, say I was saying, Mary, I couldn't agree with you more. From an industry perspective, siting and permitting is a huge issue for our industry, and something that I know they address a little bit in the bipartisan infrastructure package. But well, Scott, what do you think the future debate looks like, and kind of going forward, and what are we going to see, not just in the coming months, but heading into next year?
Thanks, Eric. And I want to echo Mary that my views and opinions presented here are my own. I'm a proud employee of the Congresswoman, but today I'm speaking on my own behalf. So thank you, Mary, for reminding me to say that. I want to touch maybe a little higher level than what Mary was getting at. Although I do believe FERC will be a big topic that going throughout the next year. But when we look towards the future conversation, what's going to play out in the midterms, a couple of points I would hit on here. I mean, one, I think, especially on the Democratic side, achieving a clean energy future is going to continue to be top of mind, regardless, well, not necessarily regardless, but no matter what happens with the bipartisan infrastructure package and with reconciliation, a clean energy future it polls very well with voters, and people want to see changes to our current energy mix that address climate change. And that's going to continue to be a big topic conversation. Embedded within that topic is jobs. And we have to think about how we connect clean energy goals to jobs. This is something that so far Biden has tried to link and make inseparable. And I think he's done a pretty good job. And this is something that you'll see folks campaigning on when they talk about the environment and achieving clean energy future. It goes hand in hand with how do we create new jobs in the clean energy sector. And then lastly, I'll just mention that what the future holds for the oil and gas sector will also play a major role in the midterms, especially for more moderate districts and areas of my experience transition away from coal. That's why we see Democrats embracing the idea more and more that we need to take care of folks whose job in, maybe in more dirty form of energy that may not exist long into the future. We need to create a transition plan for those folks. You see that being talked about a lot more and more now, and especially with members who represent more moderate districts.
Well, thanks for that, Scott. And I think you both, touched upon the infrastructure bill, and maybe we'll tackle that 800-pound gorilla, because that's very front of mind for a lot of folks in DC. But I think everybody saw the news before the Senate recessed for August. They passed landmark bipartisan infrastructure package, somewhere around the $1 trillion mark as far as funding for roads, bridges, energy infrastructure, a number of different things. But for y'all, what are some of the kind of key provisions or components of the package that you're most focused on? Maybe not just from an energy perspective, but also from a transportation perspective, because E&C is definitely getting into that space as well. But maybe I'll have you jump right in, Scott.
Sure. And reiterate a little bit and elaborate on what you said, Eric, just so everyone is on the same page. This was a sprawling $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. $550 billion of that is completely new spending. This is a historic bill. It passed the Senate 69-30. So you had more than 2/3 of the Senate voting for this. You don't see that very often with anything. It's amazing that we were able to get this passed through the Senate in the way that we did. Now it goes to the House. We'll get into the future of it maybe later. But in terms of what's actually in the bill that I think is so important, I've got some top lines that I took note of that I'll kind of go over here, because I think it's so important for everyone to hear. $73 billion for grid investments and clean energy. $73 billion. That includes a ton of funding to build out thousands of miles of new high voltage transmission lines. That's both within and across state lines. That's going to increase resilience of the grid, flexibility of the grid, and it's going to, very importantly, facilitate our ability to expand large-scale renewable energy generation in this country and get it hooked up to the grid. To achieve this, notably, it creates a grid deployment authority. I think we'll be hearing more about this in the coming days. The grid deployment authority is going to help lead this effort and will be housed under the Department of Energy. And we'll make use of publicly owned property like highways, roads, railways, so that we can more easily site and permit new transmission. On top of that, these are smaller numbers, but still important. There's $7.5 billion in this bill for EV charging. That $5 billion of that is for a national electric vehicle formula program, which is going to send money to all the states so that they can build out EV charging along highway corridors. So this is going to really help reduce range anxiety and allow folks to more comfortably purchase an EV, knowing that they can charge up pretty much anywhere along the highway once this money has been fully expended. In addition to that, the bill creates a new joint office of energy and transportation between DOT and DOE, which is very interesting and exciting. I think it's going to help to spur along development of EV charging. And there's also $7.5 billion, so same amount for EV charging. There's also another $7.5 billion for cleaner school buses and ferries. $5 billion of that is for just the buses, and that's zero emission buses and lower emission buses that run on things like natural gas. And then the other $2.5 billion is for lower emission ferries. This is going to be critical to environmental justice, removing diesel polluting buses and ferries off the road and off waterways. There's a priority in the legislation already for low-income rural and tribal areas, and it's going to have a huge impact there. And last but not least, I'll just flag $6 billion is included in this bill for struggling nuclear facilities, civilian nuclear, energy nuclear. And this will be funding that goes right to nuclear plants that are operating right now at an annual loss. And the idea is to keep these plants afloat, make sure that we don't lose more of our nuclear capacity in this nation so that we have that base load.
Thanks, Scott. Mary, what are you all focused on as you're working your way through the bipartisan bill?
Sure. So, I mean, I would say just in terms of a bigger picture, I think the amount of money is the funding. I mean, I would say we certainly have some spending fatigue over here for House Republicans. Just literally trillions of dollars have gone out the door in the last year and a half. And I think that there's some concerns here with spending with, I mean, some of these programs, are there overlapping goals in here? Is there duplication going on? And we actually raised some of this with some of these programs, even when like more one-off bills were moving through committee or that were part of the energy bill, the House partisan energy bill last year that passed, because of these very issues where you just seem to have multiple programs kind of uncovering whether it's quote grid modernization or energy efficiency. And so I think there's definitely some concern there, especially when you have the amount of dollars that you're putting into it. I mean, is it needed? Is it duplicative? Where's the oversight coming from? So I think those are some of the issues that I know we have concerns. There's also concerns here about, is this sort of outsized priority on certain forms of energy, whether it's wind, solar, EVs, and is that to the detriment of other forms of energy like natural gas, CCUS? Scott mentioned the nuclear, which I think that was a bill that came from one of our members, or at least part of the bill did. But is there stuff in there for nuclear too beyond that? So that's one thing. And then I would also say kind of, and this is I think an ongoing bigger picture issue that spans lots of different issues, but that rural versus urban, where we feel like a lot of these programs may be more beneficial on the to folks that live in cities as opposed to to folks that live in more rural areas, whether it's on the EV side or energy efficiency side with buildings. And so I think those are kind of like bigger picture issues that we have our eye on. Having said that, Scott gave the numbers, recognizing that there certainly was bipartisan support for this on the Senate side. So, we'll have to kind of see what things look like. I think the other big 800-pound gorilla in the room with reconciliation certainly has an impact too on the BIF and what that looks like going forward.
Oh, we're definitely going to get to the other 800-pound gorilla here in about 2 seconds. But because I love asking crystal ball questions, and I love just watching folks having to try and pin this down because this debate has been so fluid. But and looking in your crystal ball, does the bipartisan package get across, in your view, get across the finish line? And if so, when's it going to pass? And maybe I'll just jump it straight to Mary since she just wrapped up, and then over to Scott.
Oh, okay. I thought for sure you would start with Scott on this one. So my answer is going to be very short. I don't know. I mean, and that's true. I mean, I don't think we know. Like, I think the votes early next week are going to probably be critical to the path forward for these. And, and if you are, there's obviously like people that are looking at the BIF separately. There's people looking at reconciliation separately, people putting them together. But I mean, I do think that's going to have a big impact on the future of these different legislative vehicles and what's happening. And I mean, look, there's other stuff happening too, actually. There's funding the government that's going to come up. There's the debt ceiling that's going to come up. I mean, before long, we're going to be in NDAA world. So I don't know. I mean, this is Washington. Like, things tend to get pushed until like the holiday season hits us, and then suddenly the urgency hits. But again, I really, from the minority side, that those are just my kind of uninformed thoughts on it. Hopefully Scott will have a better answer.
Yeah, I actually heard a great analogy by someone when they were explaining how DC works, in the sense of like cliffs and fiscal cliffs is essentially just DC builds more land so that the cliff can just keep going. But Scott, what's your ballpark? Does the bipartisan package happen? When does it happen? Are we going to be here on December 23rd? Well, maybe that would be my next one for budget reconciliation. But
well, so my crystal ball, probably like Mary's, has been broken for a very long time. So I try not to rely on it too much. But here's what we do know, and here's what the challenges are in large part. As I already said, this bipartisan bill passed the Senate 69-30. So it had great support over there. It has President Biden's complete support. And it does more than likely have a significant bipartisan support in the House, meaning that if you asked members point blank, do you like what's in this bill, you would have the majority of folks in the House saying yes, they do. But here's the issue, Eric. The bill does not exist in a vacuum. Nothing on the Hill does. And this is really crucial for folks to understand when it comes to this whole infrastructure conversation. There's about 100 or so members in the House of Representatives, progressive members for the most part, or more moderate members that lean progressive, who think that the infrastructure bill, this one we're talking about, the bipartisan one, is not enough on its own, and that we also need to pass a human infrastructure bill that addresses things like climate change, healthcare, and education, just to name a few. These members see the bipartisan bill that we're talking about right now as their leverage to get the other bill passed and to have them at all pass at the same time. And they're worried that if they let the bipartisan bill that we're talking about pass on its own right now, the other bill will never happen. They will lose their leverage. There won't be enough folks who vote yes on the more expansive human infrastructure piece that folks refer to as budget reconciliation. That's just a process, but the bill I'll refer to as a human infrastructure bill, they're worried that won't get done. Further complicating this matter, just to go through it for folks, is that there's now a group of 9 more moderate Democrats in the House that are taking the opposite stand of the 100 or so progressive folks. They want to vote right now on the bipartisan bill, and they're threatening to tank the vote on the other bill if we don't pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill right away. So at this point, it's pretty unclear what the pathway forward is. Some compromise has to be made. Someone has to back down. If the group of 9 moderates back down and we go forward from there, we're likely going to pass both this bipartisan bill and the human infrastructure bill all at the same time. The earliest time frame for that is the end of September, but many things could push it farther down into the fall or even winter.
So Scott, what you're saying is it's a really great time to be a member of leadership or a leadership staffer that's got to try and navigate all the politics of this. But before I jump into the next question, maybe I'll throw it open to everybody that's joining us. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We'll keep this conversation flowing a little bit. We actually had one pop into the chat. Maybe I'll throw this to and it's a question for Scott. Is, you talked a little bit about the nuclear energy provisions that were in the bipartisan infrastructure package. How do you see nuclear energy just in general playing within this administration and where they might, as far as embracing it and taking it.
Sure, I'm happy to take this. Maybe Mary has thoughts too, but I think that this administration recognizes the importance of nuclear and wants to see nuclear succeed in a number of ways. Primarily right now, they don't want any more nuclear plants to go offline because it will, I think we all recognize it will be challenging to achieve our clean energy goals without that reliable baseline that right now we're getting from natural gas and nuclear and hydro and some geothermal. If we start taking nuclear offline, that's just more energy you have to make up with renewable assets. So I think the Biden administration recognizes that. I think I know you can see from what they're investing in, and this is happening in Congress too. Lots of folks are investing in research when it comes to new forms of nuclear energy, advanced nuclear energy. There's a big opportunity for advanced nuclear energy to be a game changer. We can talk about that more later if we want, but if it can be market competitive with other technologies, and if the waste issue gets fixed or at least lessened to a degree, nuclear energy could be a huge source of future energy in this nation.
Yeah. And Scott, I can tell you, we fully, as far as the RD&D, and I think that's why, our industry would love to see a double down effort on a lot of the RD&D, into advanced nuclear and all of the clean energy technologies to help move forward with innovation and getting and tackling those emission reductions. But Mary, do you have any thoughts?
I would just say, our members, longtime supporters of nuclear energy, for both, there's obviously zero emissions energy. It's critical base load, 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's also important to our national security. There are pieces of that sometimes get lost, but that's an important piece of it, of nuclear energy too. So, but I think that, it's obviously had a lot of challenges in the last few years and competing. But I think we are very interested in coming up with ways to protect that part of the fleet. And as Scott mentioned, our members have been pushing the small modular reactors, advanced nuclear now for quite a while. Actually, one piece in the Energy Act of 2020, and this is getting super weedy, but was on this thing called HALEU, which is high assay low enriched uranium, which is really critical for these SMRs going forward. And so, I think in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we had them before the committee, also right before recess, and that was a big focus from our side of the aisle on talking about SMRs and that part of the licensing process. And a lot of that is moving through right now. So yes, I think it's important for us to protect our baseload generation, because wind and solar are still weather dependent resources, and we can't count on them 24/7. And so it's critical that we have these baseload generation and things that we can, quickly bring up and down when we need to, or have them there all the time. And so, yeah, that's how I think that's my take on nuclear.
Yeah, thanks, Scott and Mary. And stepping back kind of 50,000 foot level again, and to bring, go to the other 800-pound gorilla that is everybody, front of mind. And it's very rare that you have two 800-pound gorillas kind of, culminating all at the same time. And as Scott, as you talked about, and I think Mary, you did too, as well as y'all CRs coming, debt limit, NDAA, you've got a lot of moving pieces that are all coming. But the other big 800-pound gorilla is this budget reconciliation bill and going through that process, which, from a House perspective, y'all are coming in next week to move forward with budget resolution. But when you look at most of like the clean energy tax credits and a lot of ideas and provisions and programs, revolving around climate change, which I think, Tracy mentioned at the beginning, a CES or carbon tax or potential, cap and trade program or something like that. A lot of that is being left for this budget reconciliation bill. What do you think might actually make its way into this budget bill, as far as some of those ideas are? Maybe start again with Scott and then jump to Mary.
Sure. And just to reiterate what I said before, this budget reconciliation bill, this human infrastructure bill, is going to primarily be around things like education and healthcare. But there will be a large portion of it that has to deal with climate change and with the energy sector to varying degrees. And what you were hinting at, Eric, is we've had a long conversation throughout the Hill and on the state level as well, as how do we have sort of a large scale program that gets us towards our clean energy goals. A carbon tax has been an idea. The Obama administration tried to do their program with power plants that got struck down by the courts. So this is where we've landed now. We're onto what is called a CES, a carbon emission standard, which the name is changing rapidly. It's now going to be a CEPP, a clean energy payment program. That's what it will be called if this ever passes. And this is how we truly get toward President Biden's clean energy goal. Under this program, retail electricity providers would be required to include ever increasing amounts of clean energy into their mix over time. And the goal is that on average, this would reach 80% clean energy by 2030, 80% by 2030. All utilities would start from where they're currently at in terms of their energy mix, so no one gets an unfair advantage. It's an equal playing field. And the large, the funding piece here, because everything in budget reconciliation has to be either spending or tax related. So the funding piece, the spending piece here is that utilities will receive funding when they meet these targets. And that's going to significantly take the burden, hopefully entirely take the burden off of ratepayers. We're talking about something in the ballpark of $100 billion or more over 10 years being dedicated just towards payments to retail electricity providers for hitting these targets, essentially funding or co-funding the deployment of new renewable technologies and other clean energy technologies. That's the CEPP. Real quickly, I'll just mention in the bill, we're also looking at tax incentives, hopefully, lots of tax incentives. It's not my area of expertise, Eric. I know it sounds like this is yours, but from what I understand, we're looking, House and Senate each, Democratic side at least, are looking to do some massive overhauls when it comes to tax incentives for clean energy. And that's what we're going to try and get into this for three things. Clean energy generation, that's key. Greater deployment of clean energy resources with renewed and increased ITCs, investment tax credits for solar, wind, carbon capture, battery storage, beyond. Tax incentives for EVs, for the sales price of EV, to get that to come down, to make it more competitive. And tax incentives for manufacturing, clean energy manufacturing, so we can build out a domestic supply chain for batteries, for EVs, for solar panels, for wind turbines. And then last but not least, we'll probably see some sort of consumer rebate when it comes to weatherizing homes and electrifying home appliances. So when you go shopping for a new stove, the price for an electric stove will be reduced due to a new program that we should have. So those are three things that we're more than likely going to see in budget reconciliation, and there may well be more when it comes to energy.
Thanks, Scott. Mary, what do you see kind of on the horizon of what may or may not be kind of budget reconciliation, what we may see?
Well, unfortunately, again, this is where, given we're on the minority side, don't have a whole lot of eyes on that beyond, I think, a lot of the public facing documents that probably a lot of folks have seen. But I mean, looking at the instructions and that came on the Senate side for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources, as well as the Environment and Public Works Committee, it looks like, as Scott mentioned, the Clean Electricity Payment Program, it seems to be the nouveau way to try to handle, I think, not being able to get a CES through BIRD because of it being a standard. So that's one. I think, it looks like a lot of more programs through DOE on EVs. There's certainly some energy efficiency things in there on the more on the EPW side. A lot of environmental justice programs. Some, I think, like air emissions programs are in there. Climate research. There's the methane tax that's in there. So I think those are some of the ones that we've seen, just that, are circling. This is one where Leader McCarthy has, come out publicly and expressed serious concerns and opposition to the reconciliation, from both just a dollar number as well as the priorities that are in it. So, I anticipate that's going to be a lot of the ongoing positions on our side of the aisle with it. It is a tremendous amount of money on top of other money, and I think on the clean electricity payment program, which is where it feels like a lot of the quote energy is at right now. A lot of that is really going to be like devil in the details, because this is something that's relatively new, at least as far as I know. So I think there's a lot of folks are trying to figure out what this looks like. So definitely want to see more and understand more the text, but certainly concerns with federal government paying monies to utilities to deploy cleaner energy. Is that really what's going to drive the outcome and results of reducing emissions or bringing more clean energy online? Some of the things that I talked about earlier about, it doesn't, at least behind closed doors, we hear it's not as much about capital. It's more to do with the being able to get the stuff built, permitted, sited, built. So, so I think that's something that we'll have our eye on too. And, I think generally our members have concerns with more and more of these things being passed on to taxpayers, ratepayers, who's bearing the burden, the economic burden of all of these programs. And, is this really what the priorities are for people right now when you have clearly inflation in the country, you have prices going up on gas, on groceries, on other things. And so is this the type of, is this really what folks are looking to have done with, especially with taxpayer dollars? So those are some of and like Scott mentioned too, we certainly will be looking at this from a holistic standpoint. The different tax incentives I think is important. The carbon border adjustment tax piece that's in there will be important to looking at the bigger picture and the cumulative impacts and effects.
Thanks, Mary and Scott. And while I would love to ask you the crystal ball question, I think you would probably just rinse and repeat what you guys said for the bipartisan infrastructure deal, like essentially just the same thing. But hopefully you guys won't ruin my Christmas plans. Luckily, I'm local, so my Christmas plans aren't me traveling anywhere. But we actually had a question come in over the chat, and I think it's more geared towards Scott. And something Tracy discussed in the beginning about environmental justice and the administration with a really strong focus on that. I know it's a big issue, not just for the Congresswoman, but for the House Democratic Caucus just in general. But you touched a little bit upon some of the programs that you're looking at, whether it's in the bipartisan infrastructure package or the reconciliation package. What are some of those plans or ideas that really impact the more urban areas, the more communities of color, and get them more and more involved in this green economy?
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for whoever sent in that question. Environmental justice is a huge priority for the Congresswoman I work for, and it is a huge priority for President Biden, who stated many times and has done more than any past president to incorporate environmental justice into his administration, into the agencies. I mentioned it before, but it can't be understated. President Biden has a Justice 40 initiative, which is across the federal government, to ensure that 40% of the benefits of any policy go towards disadvantaged communities. In the environmental justice space, you would call those environmental justice communities most burdened by pollution historically, largely communities of color, largely lower income, oftentimes tribal communities, some sorts of rural communities. This is going to be key, because especially, and I don't want to get too technical here, but when you look at budget reconciliation and what you can do through that process, you can't really say anything besides give this money in this way or tax this money in this way. You're very limited in terms of your flexibility and what you can write. And so writing things like, priorities for these groups, priorities for this group, or setting up a new interagency environmental justice task force, something like that, you can't do it through budget reconciliation. So whatever we end up passing, it's going to be critical that the Biden administration implements Justice 40 for everything, so that 40% at the minimum of the benefits, wherever have you, make it towards the communities that need it most. Having said that, there are certainly pieces, there are funding pieces within both these bills that are more important to environmental justice communities than others. Unfortunately, not a ton made it into the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has to, that really has a huge impact on environmental justice communities. Something that you've seen folks upset about and pushing for more of when it comes to budget reconciliation are, for example, greater funding for public transit and to electrify public transit. That's a huge environmental justice concern. Also removing all the lead pipes in the country and ensuring that drinking water is lead free. It's a huge environmental justice concern. There's a lot of money for water infrastructure in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but not a lot of it is dedicated towards getting the lead out of our pipes. And so that's something that we need to do when it comes to a more budget reconciliation bill. And lastly, something that the congressman I work for is working hard on is when it comes to EV charging, for example. We need to ensure that EV charging isn't just built on highways and isn't just something that folks with a garage or a private basement can afford to have. EV charging, if we want EVs to be the future and to reduce pollution burdens in communities of color and low-income communities, we need chargers on streets and public parks, libraries, school buildings, transit hubs, you name it, so that folks can buy an EV, park it on the street, and make sure it's able to charge at some point. That's something we're working hard to include in budget reconciliation, but can't say with any certainty whether or not that will be included, but we're working on it.
Yeah, and thanks, Scott. And I know we as an industry, EEI and the electric utilities I know we're working with your boss, but then just in general, as far as with the EV infrastructure and making sure that whether it's rural or urban, that everybody's included as we move towards this potential transition. That has the opportunity that as they're looking towards a new car, that EV can be an option, mostly because you have the charger there or the car itself is affordable. How about
this is Mary. I was just going to say, would you mind? I just wanted to comment on EVs and EV infrastructure, because I know I looked at the clock and time is ticking by. So I wanted to make sure that kind of made some comments on that, because that has certainly been something we've had a lot of hearings on in our committee on. The Clean Future Act has a lot in it, and I think our members have been raising these concerns throughout when it comes to EVs and EV charging. And one for sure is the supply chain of electric vehicles, and a lot of that supply chain runs through China. So a lot of concern here that we are kind of trading in our mobility security to a state that's clearly not our friend or our ally. So that's one thing I know that our members are going to keep talking about: the critical minerals, the rare earth elements, the processing of those for the battery, for lithium batteries. There's also obviously some forced labor issues in China too. And so I think understanding the supply chain and making sure that we're not putting the hands of our transportation system into a foreign actor that we don't trust is really a big piece of this that we've been talking about. I also think we need to have some conversations about the environmental footprint of electric vehicles and what that really looks like. There's a lot, like I said, if a lot of this stuff is being made in China, a lot of China manufacturing is powered through coal-fired generation. And so what does that look like too in terms of emissions associated with it? And then I would just say too, from a more monetary standpoint with electric vehicles and concerns here that it's really who's actually benefiting from from incentives and from rebates and all these different things, because it seems to be folks that are actually can afford them, which tend to be folks that are making more money, but the cost of the infrastructure and the cost of all of these incentives is being borne by all ratepayers or all taxpayers or both. So just to kind of put out there some of the concerns that our members have been raising on our side of the aisle when it comes to electric vehicles, not opposed to electric vehicles, but really want to understand the ramifications of them, and particularly not so that there aren't these bans on internal combustion engines and deadlines that are set to completely electrify the fleet without understanding what that looks like beyond just maybe saying we've electrified the fleet. So just wanted to kind of get some of those ideas out there.
No, and thanks, Mary. You actually kind of stole my thunder. Literally, I was going into the electric transportation kind of.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're perfectly fine because Scott was bringing it up towards the end. So I was going to kind of, as we get a little bit more into the weeds as far as E&C jurisdiction and what the committee is going to be looking at. I know electric transportation is going to be a big issue that is going to not just be tackled in the future, but is has been tackled in the past. And Scott, I didn't know if you wanted to say any additional things on electric transportation, because I do know that is a huge issue for your boss, but didn't know if you wanted to add in anything else on the electric transportation.
I'll just mention this because the point of this call is to make folks aware of what's going on. I think these are important kind of top line numbers from my perspective. The goal is to get to 50% EV sales by 2030. We heard Biden state that pretty clearly with a bunch of manufacturers the other day from the White House. So to do this, we're going to need to do a number of things. We're going to need massive investment and upward of 1 million charging stations across the nation within the next 10 years. We need incentives to bring down the price of EVs for consumers. And to address some of the points that Mary was bringing up, we need clean energy manufacturing incentives to make the EVs here, to make the batteries here, to bring all of that over to our shores so that our workers can be put to work making these technologies that are going to be the future, not just in this country, but all across the world. They're already becoming the future. In Biden's American Jobs Plan, there was $174 billion outlined for these purposes. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that I mentioned only has $7.5 billion for EV charging. There's a huge gap there between $174 billion that was outlined and the $7.5 billion that we have, which is why you have a lot of folks like the congresswoman I work for pushing for massive funding to be included in budget reconciliation for those tax incentives for more EV charging funding, not just for highways, but for cities, and for the manufacturing incentives.
No, thanks for those thoughts, Scott. A question that came, into the chat and deals with our industry, and that's, how are we, and it got brought up earlier on the webinar, and talking about how is our industry ensuring that, not just us, but then the communities that we're in, to ensure that there's just transition to clean energy. I know the conversations that we have with our unions, and as we move towards more and more cleaner technologies coming onto the grid, one thing we want to ensure is that our unions come with us, and the good paying jobs that we provide come with. But for Scott, what programs kind of have been talked about, within the E&C space, but then also potential inclusion? And I know you can't guess what's in budget reconciliation because of the rules and all this other stuff, but for what programs kind of are there, for that type of just transition?
Well, thanks for the question. To be honest, at the get-go here, I'm not an expert when it comes to just transitions, so I don't know the exact programs that are needed. What I do know is that this is something that folks on the House side and on the Senate side and the Biden administration are focusing more and more on. And I think this is in a bit of a bipartisan fashion. You hear folks on both sides of the aisle, on our committee in particular, talking about this, the need for a just transition, the need to make sure that folks who may lose their job for working, whether it's in an oil field or a coal field, are able to move into a clean energy field. So that conversation is starting to happen. What the policy solutions are exactly, those are still being worked out. Retraining is obviously something that's brought up a lot, but of course, folks are starting to understand more and more that you can't just easily retrain anyone to do anything. You have to retrain specifically. So that has to be figured out. And if you can't retrain, what do you do? What type of compensation can you offer folks so that if they're losing their job because of this transition, they don't all of a sudden go without a paycheck? So they're important conversations, they're being had, and solutions are being worked out, but we need to do a lot more thinking around it.
Thanks, Scott. Mary, I didn't know if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just add, I think I agree, Scott, with Scott, that, I mean, both sides have been talking about it. I'd say probably our side is saying more that we should be putting policies in place that are taking away these people's jobs to begin with. So probably looking at it a little bit differently in that respect. We actually had testify for us at a hearing earlier this year, the president of the local union for a natural gas utility, and had some really interesting insights from him on just transition and his concern and opposition to that type of approach because of the fact that he's in a natural gas utility. Those are clearly natural gas is under fire, particularly in California where he was located, and real concerns about the people in his union and how they were going to be able, if their jobs were taken away from them, what that would look like. And quite honestly, didn't really want their jobs taken away. See the benefits of natural gas, the importance of it for its base load, for its lower emissions. So I think that, yes, we're talking about just transition, but I think we're probably coming at it from two different perspectives on that part. And I think the more you start talking to people outside the Beltway and people who have the jobs in these different industries that are under threat, I think you're probably going to hear maybe something different than maybe what inside the Beltway and Washington folks are talking about. So I would just say we really need to be paying attention to those people too, and to the policies that are maybe creating these situations.
Thanks, Mary. And I know we got about 6 minutes left, so maybe I'll hit up a bipartisan buzzer beater question, just because both of you have referenced the great bipartisan work that happened at the end of last year, dealing with the energy legislation there, which was really focused on innovation, R&D, and really looking towards these future technologies and how we can bring them to market quicker and faster. What are you all, the most excited to see as far as innovation? There's a lot of discussion around storage. Hydrogen is a hot topic right now. CCUS, the flux capacitor and the Back to the Future. No, all kidding aside, but what are you all, not just you, but then some of the members that you talk to or your bosses, what are they most excited for when it comes to energy innovation? Scott or Mary can jump first.
Okay, I can jump in. So, I would say, this isn't going to come as a surprise to Scott, but I would say like a lot of our members think that innovation is what should be driving our energy future and energy policy. And it's, always better to have innovation driving as opposed to top-down kind of regulations that often stifle that actual American ingenuity and innovation and creativity. So in terms of specific technologies, I would just say again, I think the advanced nuclear is a really important place and a place that we're seeing like measurable progress happening, and things are moving through licensing process. MOUs are being put together, and so I think that's a really promising technology and one that's emissions free. Also important to American workers on that front. You mentioned hydrogen. That's certainly one we're hearing a lot about too, and trying to understand how that fits in and what that looks like. And I think that's an important one to look at. I think we have a lot of members that are interested in geothermal too, and as something to that technology and the importance of it as a potential energy source. And then certainly the CCUS, the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And this has been kind of a long time priority for a lot of our members. We were able to get some provisions on CCUS in the Energy Act of 2020. Certainly glad to see some of it in the BIF as well. And that's a technology that we hope that this administration will continue working with stakeholders on and working to implement it and give it the funding and the R&D that it needs to continue to grow.
Thanks, Mary. Scott, what's exciting for your boss when it comes to innovation?
First, I'll just say, I think innovation is pretty much a political safe zone. You'd be hard pressed to find a member of Congress or the Senate who doesn't love innovation. We're all for innovation. I think that's a really good thing. I think we can move the ball forward, and we have been moving the ball forward when it comes to innovating new technologies. We all want to see that happen. From my personal perspective, I'll agree with Mary on advanced nuclear. That would be wonderful to see, and we do see a lot of research and development being done. This administration is leading a lot of that research and development. DOE is doing a lot of work around that. It would be excellent to have a zero emission baseload source of energy for the grid. Battery recycling, something you didn't mention that I would throw out there. We're going to have more and more and more batteries that part of our energy economy, whether you're talking about EVs or you're talking about utility scale storage or Tesla packs on your wall at home. Right now, the majority of these batteries, we don't know how to recycle them very well. The economics don't work out. It's mostly because of how they're put together. They're not made to be broken down. Not that that's necessarily the solution, although that is one solution. But whatever the solution is, battery recycling will be incredibly key to keep the price of that technology down and to make sure that it's a sustainable technology. And then lastly, I'll just throw out new forms of solar. PV solar has been stuck at around 27% efficiency, from what I understand, for several years now. If we can advance our solar technology to increase that efficiency level, we could significantly increase how much energy we're getting from our solar arrays without having to increase the land mass that they're on top of. So that would all be wonderful. And I'll end with this one thing, Eric. Innovation is like I said, it's important, it's critical. But right now, regardless of innovation, we have so much of the technology because of past innovation that we need to achieve the goals we're trying to achieve. And so what we're doing right now in Congress is providing the infrastructure funding that will allow us to deploy the technologies we already have at our disposal. And that will be very key for us to meet our goals. Thank you so much.
Well, and thanks, Scott and Mary, and neither one of you touched the flux capacitor on the DeLorean with Back to the Future. So I'm a little upset about that, but I probably just dated myself as far as Back to the Future references. But I think it all started by the nickname for the bipartisan package was Biff, and that immediately, now I've just been on Back to the Future for like a month and a half. But with that, I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I want to turn it back to our host, Tracy Woods and the AABE folks to kind of wrap it up.
And Eric, and thank you so much for your masterful moderation. To Scott and Mary for your contributions as panelists. We got a little bit of everything today. We've got the update on the 117th Congress. We got a bit of legislative crossfire, which we do at AABE. So Eric, masterful in having that happen, and to Scott and Mary in bringing us this really great panel discussion. And for our audience, got your questions answered. So always check in the chat, and this panel did a great job of answering your questions. In closing, I want to share with everyone that our we have an upcoming energy policy summit. That'll be October 19th and 20th, and it's virtual. So we'll be sending information out next week so that you'll be able to review and look forward to registering. So for the audience, please join me in thanking our distinguished guest today. And we hope that you have a happy afternoon. So good afternoon, everyone.